let's beam ourselves over to London, and Rebecca Fiebrink, who's associated for lots of people with AI and machine learning, but I think kind of having seen some of the stuff that Olivia's doing with turning those things into instruments, I think you'll see that some of these also connect to instrumental technique in ways you might not expect. So we'll say hi now to Rebecca.
Thanks, Peter. And now if we could take a look at my slides, that would be great. Perfect. Okay, so of course, ever since it became feasible for computers to control sound in real time, people have been building new instruments to play digital sound in live performance. Here on top, you see Max Matthews with the radio baton from the early 80s, Michel Weisfitz performing with his controller, the hands. On the bottom, you see Letitia Tsunami with her lady's glove instrument, which she first developed in 1991 and then performed with for over 25 years. And also Marco Donnarumma, who's a Berlin-based performer who's done some amazing recent work generating music with his body using physiological sensing. I think superficially what might strike someone seeing these instruments for the first time is how different they look from a laptop, and how much more engaging or legible that performance might be compared to watching someone just standing behind a laptop and using a mouse or keyboard or MIDI controller. But what drew me to this space over a decade ago is, I think, more interesting than simply developing better ways for electronic musicians to visually connect with audiences. For me, it's the question of how new musical instruments can facilitate fundamentally new relationships between our bodies and sound. Musical experience is an embodied experience, whether one is listening, performing, or composing. Throughout history, the music we play has always been limited and shaped and led by the instruments that we use to make it, and the ways that those instruments interact with our own bodies. Research in musicology has shown that even the music we imagine is shaped by our embodied experiences with the instruments that we're familiar with. So, in principle, of course, computers are capable of making any imaginable sound and any imaginable sequence of sounds over time. So, why would we limit ourselves to imagining computer music that we can control or trigger using only these cartoonishly simple interfaces like a mouse or a keyboard or buttons and sliders? Why wouldn't we devote more effort to creating digital instruments that pair the limitless sound possibilities of computers with our natural human capacity for embodied creativity, exploration, communication, and nuance? One answer has been that historically it's actually been incredibly difficult to create new instruments like the ones you see on screen. These require substantial expertise in electronics and computer programming, as well as a lot of experimentation to get it right. So, say for instance, you wanted to build a new instrument that uses hand movements to play digital sound. First, you've got to figure out what sensors to use to get information about what your hand is doing, and then to get that information into a computer. But that's actually the easy part, right? The hard part is then how do you actually tell the computer how it should decide what sounds to make based on the information that it sees from these sensors? How do you build an instrument that is comfortable to play, that looks engaging or at least not silly for an audience, that gives you a way of playing music that feels natural and easy to learn, that gives you access to sounds that you actually want to use in a performance, and so on? This is a hugely difficult design problem, and it's very difficult to program such a computer system, even for somebody who is an expert programmer. And this is a problem that I became very interested in addressing in my PhD work nearly a decade ago. My PhD was in computer science, but I was collaborating with a number of experimental musicians who were interested in building the kinds of instruments that you see on screen. And together we realized that machine learning could be used to help musicians build new instruments more easily. So if you could go to the next slide. I ended up building a software tool for instrument building called Wekinator. It's still around. It's been downloaded over 25,000 times, and it's been used in performances around the world, in all sorts of music, as well as visual art, interactive art, and other types of creative projects. Now, I want to be clear here. Well, Wekinator is not intelligent in any sense. It just uses machine learning to help people design instruments more effectively. Specifically, anyone can build a new instrument by providing examples of performer actions paired with examples of sounds. So, for instance, if I wanted to build this hand controlled instrument, maybe using a camera or a glove to sense how my hand is moving, I could start by giving an example of some hand gesture I want to make paired with the sound that I want the computer to make when I do that gesture. Then I can make another example using another hand gesture and another sound. Once I have a small number of these examples, Wacnator uses a machine learning algorithm to build me a model, which is just a very simple computer program capable of making decisions about what sound to play whenever it sees a new action from my hand. I can then play this new instrument by moving my hand. Data from the sensor will get sent to the model, and the model will decide what sound to play in response. And as I move my hand, the sound will change. So there's three important things I want to call your attention to here. First, building and changing an instrument this way is very fast. I can start by providing just 2 or 3 examples, and Wacnator will build me a model in a few seconds or even less. And then I can immediately try out my new instrument. If it does something I don't like, I can change its behavior by giving Wacnator different examples and rebuilding the model. And a few seconds later, I can have a modified instrument. Similarly, if I come up with some new idea and say, well, I'm kind of happy with what it's doing right now, but what would happen if I did something different? I can make some new examples and have that instrument to try out right away. Second, it's really easy with this process to make instruments that are very complicated. You could have dozens or even hundreds of values coming from sensors, controlling dozens or hundreds of parameters of sound synthesis or sound processing. As an instrument creator, you still only need to provide a few example actions and a few example sounds. And then the machine learning does the hard bit of figuring out how the model should connect all those dozens or hundreds of numbers together. And the third thing I want to say is that this process makes it very easy to build instruments that surprise you, that give you sounds you never imagined before. So if I build my hand gesture model using maybe 2 hand gesture examples, and then I show it a gesture in between those two, it's likely to give me a sound that's sort of in between my examples. Or I could do something totally different with my hand, and I'm likely to get a totally different sound from the example sounds I put in when I was building the model. So these 3 properties, the speed of creating and changing an instrument, the ability to create complex instruments that control lots of things simultaneously, and the ability to generate designs with surprising behaviors, these can make the process of instrument building very playful, very exploratory, even improvisatory and expressive. For these reasons, I often talk about Wacnator as a meta instrument. Again, there's nothing particularly intelligent about it, despite its use of machine learning. It's absolutely not a human-like musical collaborator, but it is something that feels like a creative and expressive tool while you're using it. And I should mention that it is possible to build new instruments on stage using Wacnator as part of a performance, and that's what I did in my very first performance with the tool. But most people do this process ahead of time and then just take their model, use a fixed instrument on stage. So I want to finish up by showing you a couple examples of instruments people have built using Wacnator and similar tools. I should mention that Wacnator is open source and free, so you can try it out if you're interested. So the first video I want to show you, if you go to the next slide, is a piece by Anne Heggie called From the Waters. And here, each of the performers is holding on to 2 strings, which send information about their position in space to a laptop that generates sound. So if you could play the video now, that would be great. So I find this is just a beautiful piece, both to listen to and to watch. And as you can probably tell, Anne had very specific ideas in mind for how she wanted performers in this piece to move together. It's sort of similar to a yoga sun salutation. And she had specific ideas for how she wanted the music to unfold as they do those movements. It would be very difficult for a programmer to build this kind of instrument by writing code, but Anne was able to build it fairly easily just by demonstrating the movements and sounds that she wanted. If you could go on to the next slide. The second video you'll see is Letitia Tsunami, the creator of the Lady's Glove, playing her new instrument, the Spring Spire. Physically, this instrument uses 3 springs stretched across a metal frame. And information about the frequency content in each vibrating spring is sent to Wekinator, which controls several dozen sound synthesis parameters in MaxMSP. Letitia's been using Wekinator for 8 years now to build and compose for the Spring Spire. The physical body of this instrument stays the same for each piece, but she's constantly retraining, rebuilding the machine learning models to achieve different sonic results and different playing techniques in different pieces, or even in different sections of the same piece. So if you could please play the video now. All right. I love that piece. I love so many things about it. And of course, one of the things that excites me is that, not only could you not really build this kind of instrument without machine learning just because of its sheer complexity, I think you'd probably agree with me that you could not make this type of music without this kind of instrument, right? You couldn't play this kind of music on a keyboard. You couldn't play this kind of music by taking 100 sliders and moving them up and down with your mouse. Certainly not live, but arguably you wouldn't even do this if you were trying to compose something in the studio. For Letitia, a lot of the value in using Wekinator lies in its ability to not just make complex stuff like this, but in its ability to surprise her with new sounds and new relationships between movement and sound. She said, and I quote, in a way, you don't want the instrument to perform like a well-trained animal circus. You kind of want it to be a little wild, and you want to adapt to it somehow, like riding a bull. I think the machine learning allowed more of this fun of exploring instead of going, I have to have a result right away. This thing is going to do that, and then leaving it at that. Now, if you go on to the last slide, I want to mention one last thing, which is that the early success of Wekinator's approach to instrument building has led me to a number of other related research projects over the last decade. Some of these investigate how we can use the same techniques to develop meta instruments for interactive art, for games, for interactions in other domains. And some of this research explores other applications in music. One project I'm particularly proud of is something called Sound Control, in which we built a Wekinator-like interface using machine learning for music therapists and music teachers to create new musical instruments for kids with disabilities. This is also open source software that we've put out there for anybody to use. And one of the great outcomes of this project has been looking at how music teachers and therapists have taken this approach to building things that my research team and I never anticipated. So in some cases, they have built bespoke musical instruments for individual kids, which was the original intention of the project. All right, allowing kids to use gestures that they can comfortably execute to play sounds either alone or with others. But the teachers here have also done all sorts of other things that I think challenge our conventional notions of what instruments are and why we might build them. For instance, they've made musical games for kids that allow them to move in different ways that encourage them to exercise greater agency over sound than they're often able to exercise in other contexts of their lives, and they've developed interactions that enable kids to interact socially with other people, facilitated through music. So I'll leave things there.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Before we move on, actually, also because I know Lars is working in some related fields, I wonder, even though you kind of hinted at this and explained that, Wekinator should not be kind of seen as something that has intelligence, how would you characterize the difference in these approaches, Wekinator and what we just saw with sound control, from previous attempts to solve some of the same kind of problems? Or what was the, for people who may not kind of understand how the mechanisms of this stuff works, what was the sort of what was the sort of difference in the way that you were approaching this versus maybe previous kind of historical approaches to solving some of the same kinds of control mapping, data processing problems?
That's a great question. And people like David Wessel and his collaborators had experimented with a number of the same techniques that are inside of Wekinator, specifically neural networks in their work. They'd been experimenting with these since the 90s. So I definitely wasn't the first person to think about machine learning as a useful tool in this space. But a couple things happened to make Wekinator possible and to enable, I think, a very qualitatively different set of outcomes. The first thing that happened is simply computers got faster. And something that would have taken minutes or even longer to train on a computer in the 90s, now, when I was doing this PhD work 10 years ago, even then it took maybe half a second or even less. And when you are working at that short time scale, suddenly things become interactive, and I would argue very, very playful in a way that they aren't when you have to sit around and wait for something. And then the second thing that happened is that, I was very interested in, I didn't set out to build a tool for musical instrument building per se. I set out to kind of ask questions with the musical collaborators that I had about, what was this kind of real-time machine learning process enabled by modern computers? What was it good for? And was it good for building instruments? Was it good for other things? And once we had a sense of what it was good for, how did we actually enable a tool that supported people who weren't just computer scientists, just people working with me in my research lab? And so there was a lot of work. The initial version of Wekinator, I spent months doing regular demo sessions and meetings and tutorials and workshops with a whole bunch of different composers, exploring these ideas together and ultimately coming up with an interface that started to make sense, that started to be usable by someone who didn't know anything about machine learning, didn't know anything about what the algorithms were doing, but maybe knew a little bit of Max or Chuck or some other music programming language and knew how to plug in some sensors and get some data. And so from that, there were a lot of surprises for me as somebody who came to this with a machine learning background. The ways that we used machine learning in Wekinator were totally different from the ways that I was taught you should use machine learning when I took classes at university. And we ended up doing things like enabling people to make the data set on the fly and change the data set as many times as they want. And we threw out the ways that you're supposed to evaluate a machine learning model and replaced it with different ways that make more sense for music. And so I think all of this ultimately was enabled by the fact that you could do things really quickly, and I spent, frankly, just a lot more time with musicians experimenting with this stuff than people had been able to do in previous research.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that makes sense to me that musicians would want to kind of just play with stuff, basically play with stuff until it sounds good. That would be pretty.
Yeah.
That would be pretty different from a data science, machine learning approach where you're trying to objectively evaluate how well a particular approach is working, right? Does this
Absolutely, and it's a completely different view of what machine learning is good for and what data is good for.
did you get any feedback from people in sort of data science communities after seeing musicians work that way? Was that interesting to them, or still weird, or?
Yeah, I mean, I subsequently have been hired into a couple computer science departments, so there's enough really, more traditional computer sciencey folks who believe that there's something useful there. But at the same time, I've given talks to machine learning researchers at a number of different, top companies and research venues, and a lot of them really struggle to still, I think, to see why anybody would ever want to do this. And I think that's understandable. It was hard for me to understand all the things that musicians were telling me about why my assumptions were wrong, about why we don't want big data, we want small data, and maybe we don't want models that always generalize to new people in new situations, that maybe we want to build something that just works really well for one performer under one set of stage lighting for one performance, and so on.
I was curious when you talked about that some of this was enabled by the performance capabilities of the machines, and this is also true of some of the stuff that Olivia's doing would not have been as much fun to do in, say, 90s Flash or Director.
Yeah.
But does that mean, and I'm not, sponsored by NVIDIA or Apple or something, but does that mean that this kind of next generation of machine learning processing powers, will that enable some new kinds of real-time interactions or play or instruments?
I believe so. I think we're at the cusp of many of these, I would say the deep learning advances from the last 10 to 15 years. We're at the cusp of enough of them becoming fast enough or optimized enough by a lot of really smart engineers to be playful in real time in the same ways that non-deep machine learning became possible when I was doing my PhD work and shortly before. And I think we're seeing now a bit of that starting to surface in commercial products outside the music realm. Adobe just launched a new set of experimental tools where you can use deep learning to apply different effects to to your work in Photoshop, and that, again, suddenly we're in the interactive space as opposed to hitting a button and letting something run and coming back.
That's right. So you open Photoshop and you get skin smoothing, and at least for my copy of Photoshop, it was skin smoothing and style transfer. So it's kind of like the 2020 equivalent of the emboss filter, but AI.
Yeah.
Of course, now those of you in the audience, I know that since again you're in the future, when we recorded this, you may have only just ordered your M1 Mac, and now because it is the future, it's arrived. Your FedEx has arrived, and you've opened it. So we can ask the audience, to our future selves, to tell us how good it is or not, I guess. Well, thanks so much, Rebecca. So we'll continuing with that theme, and then we'll kind of come back and talk all together.